Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want you to think about how much of your life depends on a piece of metal you have never once looked at. The bolt in the seat you're sitting on, the cable in the elevator you took this morning, the little steel hook, no bigger than your fist, that holds a man 4 stories above a parking lot while he paints a water tower. Nobody checks those things. We assume somebody already did. Today's story is about a man whose entire job was checking those things, and about the day someone he trusted used that knowledge against him. He ended up in a hospital bed with both legs in casts, and the only person in the world who knew what was actually happening was 9 years old and had a shoebox full of rusty junk under her bed. Here's what makes this one stick with me. There's no gunfight. There's no fist fight. The man in this story wins because he understood something most people never learn. Metal keeps records. Every piece of steel that has ever been poured carries a number that says where it came from, and that number does not care who you are or how good your lawyer is. Stay with me on this one, because the moment a 9-year-old girl reaches over and turns a phone face down on a hospital tray, everything you think you're watching changes. Ross Kastner had climbed the Kinsler standpipe so many times he could tell you the temperature by the sound the ladder made. Cold mornings, the rungs rang high and thin, like somebody tapping a wine glass. Summer, they went flat and dull. That October Saturday, the 10th, they rang high, and he remembered thinking it would be a good day to work, because the paint would go on tight, and Tilly's soccer game wasn't until noon. He was 41 years old, and he was the third Kastner to make his living above the town instead of in it. His grandfather had painted these same tanks with a bosun's chair and a bucket of red lead. His father, Alan, had converted the business to rope access in the 80s, and had a saying he repeated so often that Ross had it stitched into the crew jackets: "Load doesn't lie." That was the whole trade, really. People lie. Paperwork lies. Weather forecasts lie. Load does not. You hang a weight on a piece of steel, and the steel tells you exactly what it is, immediately, without argument. Kastner Height and Spire operated out of a converted feed store on the east edge of Kinsler, Ohio, a town of about 11,000 people that had been built around a mill and had outlived it. The shop smelled like linseed oil and cut rope. There were 4 employees: Bruce Lindquist, 58, who had taught Ross to climb and now mostly ran the ground because his knees had quit; Kyle Trainer, 30, fast and careful, the best young climber Ross had ever trained; a part-time bookkeeper; and Ross. The bookkeeper was his wife. Rosalind had come into the business 11 years earlier, right after Tilly was born, because the accountant they'd been paying was charging them $400 a month to enter numbers she could enter herself. She was good at it, better than good. She built the inventory system that tracked every carabiner, every shackle, every length of rope by serial number, purchase date, and inspection cycle. And she kept the gear log in a green cloth binder that lived in the shop safe. At some point in the last 2 years, Ross had stopped being able to tell what she was thinking. It hadn't been a fight. That was the strange part. There was no fight to point at. She just got quieter in a way that had a shape to it, like a room where the furniture has been moved an inch. She started keeping her phone face down on the counter. She started taking the recycling out at 9 at night, which took 11 minutes, which was 9 minutes longer than the recycling took. Ross noticed all of it and filed all of it, because that was how he was built. And then he did the thing that men like him do, which was decide he was being paranoid and put the file away. His daughter did not put it away. Tilly Kastner was 9, small for it, with her mother's straight dark hair and her grandfather's habit of staring at a thing for a long time before saying anything about it. She collected metal, not coins, not jewelry, metal, washers, cotter pins, a brass hose fitting, the head of a ball-peen hammer she'd found in a creek. She kept it in a butter cookie tin with a Christmas scene on the lid, under her bed, and she could tell you where every single piece had come from and what day she'd found it. Ross had encouraged this, because it was the only hobby of hers he could actually participate in. He taught her to read stamps. He'd hand her a shackle from the shop bin and hold a magnifier over the bow and show her the little raised letters. "That's the maker," he'd say. "That's the size. That number is the working load limit, in tons. And that one, that's the heat number." What's a heat number? Every batch of steel that gets poured at a mill gets a number, like a birthday. If you know the heat number, you can find out what furnace it came from. What day? Who tested it? Everything. She'd thought about that with the seriousness she gave everything. So it can't lie about where it's from. That's right, Till. It can't lie about where it's from. He'd remember that conversation later, in a hospital bed, with a morphine drip in his arm, and the ceiling tiles going soft at the edges, and it would be the closest thing to a plan he had. The Saturday work was routine. The Kinsler standpipe is 130 feet of welded steel, painted municipal blue, with the town's name on it in letters 6 feet tall. The county had contracted Kastner Height and Spire to do a coating inspection and spot repair on the upper catwalk, which meant Ross would rig off the roof rail, drop to the catwalk level, and spend 6 hours on rope grinding rust bloom and priming. He rigged it the way he had rigged 10,000 jobs. 2 anchor points, primary and backup, redundancy in everything, because his father used to say that a man who trusts one of anything is a man who has already fallen and just doesn't know the date yet. At 9:40 in the morning, he leaned back into his harness to load the system. The primary anchor shackle, a bow shackle, rated at 4 3/4 tons, a piece of hardware designed to hold the weight of a small car, deformed, opened, and released at somewhere under 900 pounds. He fell 34 feet and hit the lower service platform feet first. Kyle Trainer, on the ground, said later that the sound was not the sound of a man falling. It was the sound of a dropped toolbox, and then nothing at all, and then Kyle screaming into a radio. Both tibias, the right fibula, a compression fracture at L1. His left ankle went into the joint in 4 pieces. He did not lose consciousness, which he would come to consider the single luckiest thing that happened to him that year, because it meant that while he was lying on his back on a steel grate, with his legs pointing in directions legs don't point, staring straight up at 130 feet of blue steel, he was fully awake for one thought, and one thought only. He had inspected that shackle on Thursday, and on Thursday it had been the right one. To understand why a 4 3/4 ton shackle came apart under the weight of one man, you have to go back to the middle of August, and to a smokestack at the old Fairlane mill. The mill had been dead since 2004, but the stack was still standing, 180 feet of brick with a steel liner, and the county wanted it inspected before they decided whether to drop it or keep it as what the tourism board optimistically called a heritage feature. Ross took the job because it was 3 days of work, and because he liked old brick. On the second morning, Kyle Trainer came down off the stack, holding a shackle in his gloved hand, like it was a dead bird. "Boss, look at this." It had come out of a fresh box. Kastner Height and Spire bought its hardware from Hollister Safety Supply, a family distributor 2 towns over in Merrow Glen that had been selling fall protection to Ohio contractors for 30 years. Ross's father had bought from Barnett Hollister personally. The relationship went back further than Ross's career did. Ross took the shackle over to the truck and put a magnifier on it. There are 4 things stamped into the bow of a load-rated shackle: the manufacturer's mark, the size, the working load limit, and the heat number, that little birthday Ross had explained to his daughter. The manufacturer's mark was right. The size was right. The working load limit said 4 3/4 tons. The heat number was stamped in a font that was very slightly too round. Nobody on earth would have caught it except a man who had been reading those 4 stamps every working day for 19 years. Ross went to the truck bin and pulled out a shackle he knew was genuine from a lot he'd bought in 2019 and set them side by side under the glass. The pin threads on the new one were cut, not rolled. The forging flash line was in the wrong place, and when he weighed them on the shop scale that evening, the new one came in 11% light. 11% less steel, in a part whose entire job is to be enough steel. He did not call the police. He did not call Hollister. He called Bruce Lindquist, who came into the shop at 8 at night with his reading glasses on a chain, held the thing up to the fluorescent tube for a long moment, and said one word: Peter. Peter Faraday had been 27 years old. He'd worked for a competitor, Vesper Industrial Coatings, out of Merrow Glen, and 14 months earlier he had fallen 60 feet off a grain leg outside of Ellicott and died on the way to the hospital. The state report said the anchor connector failed. The state report also said the connector could not be located at the scene, which happens more often than anyone would like, because a small piece of steel bounces a long way when it lets go, and grass is grass. The finding had been operator error, improper anchor selection. Peter Faraday, a young man with a wife and a 14-month-old, had been quietly recorded in a state database as a man who had rigged his own death. Ross had gone to the funeral. He had shaken the hand of a 25-year-old widow named Franny Faraday and told her he was sorry, and then he had gone home and told his crew, for the 9th or 10th time that year, to check their anchors. Standing in his own shop with an 11% light shackle in his hand, Ross understood that he might have shaken that woman's hand and gone home to the wrong lesson. He drove to Merrow Glen on a Thursday to see Drew Hollister. Drew was 43, and he was the son. Barnett Hollister had built the company out of a pickup truck. Drew had come home from business school in 2011 and modernized it, which mostly meant he replaced 2 warehousemen with a software subscription and started importing. He was easy to like. That was the thing Ross would think about later, over and over. Drew Hollister was genuinely, effortlessly easy to like. He remembered your kids' names, he sent a ham at Christmas, he came out to job sites in clean boots and asked good questions. He listened to Ross for 6 minutes in a conference room with a wall of framed safety awards, turned the shackle over twice, and said all the right things. "That's a serious catch, Ross. Let me pull the lot. I'll get the mill certs. If this is a bad batch out of the overseas plant, we quarantine it today." He called 2 days later and said the lot checked out. Certified. Proof tested. He'd send the paperwork. The paperwork came. It was beautiful. Certificate of proof test, 100% of production, signed by a third-party inspector named Greg Quimby of Anvil Certification Services, with a stamp and a date and a lot number that matched the box. And Ross, who had spent his whole life being told that steel doesn't lie, but had somehow never extended the same suspicion to paper, did the only thing left. He put a shackle from that lot in a padded envelope and mailed it to Brayton Testing Laboratory in Columbus, along with a check for $410, and asked them to pull it to destruction. He told exactly 3 people he had done it: Bruce, Kyle, and his wife. The phone in the Kastner kitchen buzzed 3 times on the night of September the 11th. Tilly was at the table with a workbook. She noticed it because she noticed everything, and because the sound had a shape she had learned. Not a call, not one text. 3 separate buzzes, spaced out, maybe 4 seconds apart, like somebody knocking. Her mother, who had been loading the dishwasher, stopped with a plate in her hand, dried her hands on a towel, said she was going to take the recycling out, and went into the garage. Tilly counted. 11 minutes. It had happened before. Tilly knew it had happened before because she had started writing it down, not in a diary, she didn't have a diary, but on the inside of the lid of a butter cookie tin, in pencil, in a column of dates, because writing things down on metal felt more permanent than writing them on paper. August 3, August 19th, August 30th, September 11th. She did not know what it meant. She was 9. She knew only that on the days the phone buzzed 3 times, her mother went out to the garage and came back different, and that her father, who could look at a wall and tell you what year it was built, did not seem to hear the phone at all. On the last Tuesday in September, Tilly went into the garage after school to get her bike, and there was a man standing in it. He was big, and he was calm, and he was looking at the wall where her dad's climbing gear hung on labeled pegs. He wore a gray work jacket with no company on it. He turned around and saw a 9-year-old girl in the doorway, and he smiled at her. And it was a completely normal smile, and he said, "Hey there. Your mom in?" Tilly said her mom was inside. He said, "I'm from the supply company, just dropping something off." And he walked past her, out the side door, and got into a white pickup with a ladder rack and no lettering on it, and drove away. She told her mother. Her mother said it was probably somebody from work and not to worry about it, and then her mother stood in the garage doorway for a long time. Tilly did not tell her father, because her mother asked her not to, and because at 9 you still believe that your parents are on the same team. 2 weeks later, on the 3rd of October, Brayton Testing Laboratory in Columbus called Ross Kastner on his cell phone while he was sitting in his truck outside Tilly's school. The metallurgist's name was Dr. Peter Halvard, and he had the flat, careful voice of a man who has learned to deliver bad news without decorating it. The shackle had been pulled to destruction on a calibrated tensile frame. Rated working load limit, 4 3/4 tons. Design factor requires a minimum braking strength of 6 times that. It should have gone somewhere north of 28 tons. It failed at 10.8. 38% of where it should have been. And the fracture surface, Halvard said, showed something worse than bad steel. It showed that the heat number stamped on the bow did not correspond to any alloy in the part. The stamp was decorative. "Mr. Kastner," he said, "I've been doing this for 22 years. In my opinion, this is not a manufacturing defect. This is a counterfeit part with a forged identity. And if it is in general distribution, people are going to die." Ross sat in his truck outside Ardmore Elementary and watched his daughter come out the double doors with her backpack on both shoulders, and he did the arithmetic on how many boxes of that hardware were sitting in how many trucks in 11 states. He called Bruce. He called an OSHA regional office and left a message asking for a call back Monday. And he went home and told his wife that on Monday morning he was going to hand the whole thing over. The sample, the lab report, the certificates, the lot numbers, and that it was going to end Hollister Safety Supply, and probably Barnett Hollister with it. Rosalind was at the sink. She had her back to him. She said, "Are you sure it's worth it? Barnett's an old man." He said, "Peter Faraday was 27. She didn't say anything else. She dried her hands, and she picked up her phone off the counter, and she carried it upstairs. 3 days later, he was on the standpipe. The green cloth gear log in the shop safe would later show that on Friday, October the 9th, at 4:15 in the afternoon, a replacement bow shackle had been drawn from inventory and installed in Ross Kastner's personal anchor kit, and that the entry had been initialed. The initials were R.K. Rosalind Kastner, Ross Kastner. In a family business, those are the same 2 letters. Kinsler County General is not a big hospital. It has 4 floors, and the 4th is orthopedics. And Ross Kastner spent 9 days in room 412 with both legs in external fixators, steel rings and rods bolted through the bone, a device that looked, to him, exactly like scaffolding. He found that funny in a way that alarmed the nurses. The surgeon had put 90 minutes into his left ankle and told him, gently, that he would walk, and that he would probably not climb. Rosalind cried in the hallway where the nurses could see her. She brought him a phone charger and a paperback, and she sat in the vinyl chair with her hands in her lap, and she asked him, twice, whether he had ever gotten the lab report back, and whether it was in the house or the shop. He told her the shop. It was, in fact, in neither. He had emailed it to himself and to Bruce, and had never printed it, and he had no idea, then, why he lied. He would think about that a great deal later. Some part of him had been keeping a file for 2 years without ever opening it. On the 4th day, a Wednesday, Rosalind had to go to a thing at the school. Tilly stayed. It was the first time Ross had been alone with his daughter since the fall. She climbed up onto the edge of the bed the way kids do, sideways, careful of the rods, and she looked at the fixators for a long time. "Does it hurt?" "Not right now. There's a button." "Can I see the button?" He showed her the button. She approved of the button. They watched 20 minutes of a cooking show. The window went orange and then gray. Somewhere down the hall, a cart went by with a bad wheel. At 6:40 in the evening, his phone buzzed on the tray table. Tilly's head came up like a deer's. Ross reached for it, and his daughter got there first. She didn't grab it. She put 2 fingers on the back of the case and turned it over, face down, on the tray, and slid it away from his hand. "Dad, don't answer it." He laughed. "Because that's what you do." "Till, not today." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the door. Something in the room changed temperature. Ross Kastner had spent 19 years hanging off buildings, and the thing that keeps a man alive in that job is not strength or nerve, it's an animal willingness to take a bad feeling seriously before he can explain it. He had ignored that instinct exactly twice in his life. Once about his marriage, once on a Saturday morning in October. He did not ignore it a 3rd time. "Okay," he said quietly, "tell me why." She didn't. She was counting. The phone buzzed a 2nd time. Face down on the tray, it made a duller sound, a knuckle on a table. Tilly's hand found the rail of the bed and closed around it. "Baby, talk to me." "When it does it 3 times, she said, in a small, flat voice. Mom goes outside. The hallway light under the door was a strip of white. A shadow crossed it and did not come back. The phone buzzed a 3rd time. Tilly slid off the bed. She reached over and took her father's hand, not his fingers, his whole hand, in both of hers, the way she used to when they crossed a parking lot. "Okay," she said. Now we have to go. There was a woman on the ward that night named Elspeth Hargis, a night charge nurse with 26 years in, who had been raised by a man who worked in a rolling mill and who had learned young to trust the moment when the noise in a room stops. She was at the station when a 9-year-old girl came around the corner, pushing an empty wheelchair she had taken from the alcove by 408, and said, "My dad has to move rooms right now." Elspeth said later that she did not think about it. She said the child's face did the thinking for her. They got Ross into the chair, badly, painfully, in a way that made him grip the armrests until his knuckles went white, and Elspeth Hargis pushed him not toward the elevators, but through the double doors into the linen corridor, the service spine of the 4th floor that the public never sees, and from there to a soiled utility bay where she parked him behind a cart and told him not to make a sound and walked back out alone. There was a man in room 412 40 seconds later. He was big and calm, and he wore a gray work jacket with no company name on it, and he had a visitor badge that a review of the front desk log would later show had been issued to a name that did not exist. He was standing at the head of the bed, and his hand was on the IV pump. Elspeth Hargis, 5'3", walked in and said, brightly, "Can I help you, hun?" He said he had the wrong room. He apologized. He was very polite. He walked out past her, past the station, past the elevators, and took the north stairwell down. Security got there in 4 minutes. The man was gone. The badge was in a trash can in the 2nd floor landing. And that is the entire story of the night. And it is why, when Ross Kastner told 2 Kinsler police officers the next morning that his fall had been sabotage and that someone had just come to his room to finish it, one of them wrote it down and the other one looked at the morphine pump. Because here is what they had. They had a man on heavy narcotics who had suffered a catastrophic fall and a spinal fracture. They had a 9-year-old who had gotten scared. They had a nurse who had turned a stranger out of a room, which is a thing that happens in hospitals about once a month, usually a lost relative. They had no fingerprints on the IV pump because Elspeth had, in her own words, cleaned the whole thing down before I thought about it. And they had a wife. Rosalind Kastner came in at 8 in the morning and she was magnificent. She was frightened for him. She held his hand. She told the detective, Sybil Ordway, that Ross had been under enormous pressure, that he had been obsessing over a hardware thing for months, sleeping 4 hours, snapping at the crew. She said it kindly. She said it the way you say a thing you wish weren't true. She used the phrase, "Since the accident, he's been convinced," which is a sentence that ends a conversation. Detective Ordway was not a bad person. She was one detective in a department of 9 in a county with a fentanyl problem, and she did what a reasonable person does with a story about counterfeit steel and assassins in hospital scrubs, which was to write it down carefully, promise to look into it, and go do something else. 2 days later, she called Ross to say that Kastner Height and Spire's gear log showed a shackle had been drawn and installed on October 9th, by him, initialed RK, and that OSHA's preliminary read on the standpipe fall was, and he would want to sit down for this, improper anchor selection, operator error, the same 3 words that had been written about Peter Faraday. The physical evidence, the failed shackle, the 2 halves of it, which Kyle Traynor had picked up off the gravel with shaking hands and put into a Ziploc bag and handed to a Kinsler patrol officer at the scene, had been logged into the property room on October 10 and could not, when Ordway went looking on October 21st, be located. It was not stolen. There was no dramatic break-in. There was a handwritten line in a logbook, an evidence tech who had retired 8 days earlier, and a shelf where a bag should have been. Ross lay in a bed in a room he'd been moved to under a chart name of Ross Kane, at Elspeth Hargis's quiet insistence, and stared at a ceiling and understood the actual shape of the thing that was happening to him. They didn't need to kill him. That had just been the tidy version. All they needed was for him to be a man with 2 broken legs, a wrecked career, a devoted wife telling everyone he'd cracked, an OSHA finding of operator error against his own company's name, and no sample, no physical evidence, and no lab. Because on October 12th, while he was in surgery, Brayton Testing Laboratory in Columbus received a signed letter on Kastner Height and Spire letterhead from the company's authorized financial officer, withdrawing the test request, requesting the return of all materials, and asking that the file be closed. The signature on it was hers. He had a phone, a daughter, and 40% of his body immobilized, and everything he owned that could prove he was telling the truth was gone. Except that it wasn't. Because 17 days earlier, on a Friday afternoon, a 9-year-old girl had come out to the driveway to wait for her father's truck and had found, lying in the gravel next to the trash cans, a shiny steel shackle with a little raised birthday stamped into the bow, and she had put it in her tin. Bruce Lindquist brought the tin to the hospital in a grocery bag because Tilly told him to. She had made her decision on a Sunday, sitting on the floor of her room with the lid off, and what decided it was not fear. It was the pencil column on the inside of the lid. August 3, August 19th, August 30th, September 11th. She had added October 9 to it, the Friday, because that was the night the phone buzzed 3 times, and her mother went out to the garage and came back and stood in the kitchen with the lights off. The next morning her father fell. A 9-year-old cannot articulate a theory of conspiracy. What Tilly had was a list of dates and a bad feeling, and the sense, the specific, awful, 9-year-old sense, that she had been holding a piece of the thing in her hands the whole time. She gave Bruce the tin and said, "Tell my dad the one on top is from the driveway." Ross went through it in his lap on a hospital tray table with a magnifier Kyle brought from the shop. 41 pieces of scrap metal, a brass hose fitting, 11 washers, a skate key, and on top, a 3/4-inch bow shackle, screw pin, galvanized, with a working load limit of 4 3/4 tons, rolled threads, correct flash line, correct weight, and a heat number in the right font. This was the real one. The one that had been in his kit on Thursday when he inspected it, and that had been removed on Friday afternoon and thrown in the gravel by the trash cans by somebody in a hurry who assumed a piece of steel the size of a fist would simply cease to exist. His daughter had picked it up because it was pretty. Ross Kastner sat in a hospital bed and started laughing, and then he couldn't stop, and a nurse came in, and he waved her off with tears running down his face, because the thing he was holding was not evidence of a crime. It was a serial number. Here is the part that most people don't know, and it is the part that took Barnett Hollister's company apart. Steel has an audit trail. When a mill pours a heat, it assigns that heat a number and issues a material test report, the mill cert, that records the chemistry and the mechanical properties of that specific batch. Every forging made from that heat inherits the number. Reputable manufacturers stamp it. Distributors record it against lot numbers on the packing list. Contractors log it against serial numbers in a gear register, which meant that the shackle in the tin, the genuine one, carried a heat number that would appear on a real mill cert, tied to a real lot, sold on a real invoice. And the one that killed his legs carried a heat number that would appear on nothing at all. 2 pieces of hardware, sold as identical, out of boxes with the same lot number printed on them, one with an ancestry, one with a costume. You do not need a jury to understand metallurgy. You need a jury to understand that a company sold 2 different things out of the same box and charged for the better one. He asked Kyle to bring him the shop's inventory export. He asked Bruce to pull every packing list from Hollister Safety Supply going back 6 years. And, on a legal pad, in handwriting that got steadier as the fixators came off in November and then December, he began to build a map. His attorney was a woman named Georgette Lamb, 48, who had spent 9 years doing product liability for a defense firm in Cleveland before deciding she'd rather sleep at night. She came out to the shop in January, looked at the wall of the back office, where Ross had taped up 140 packing lists in a grid with heat numbers highlighted in 3 colors, and stood very still for about a minute. "How many of these," she said finally, "are decorative? So far? 61% of everything they sold us after 2022. Mr. Kastner, you understand this is not a divorce case. I know what it is." "No," she said. "I don't think you do yet. You're not describing a bad supplier. You're describing an entire product line with a manufactured provenance. That's not negligence. That's a factory." Franny Faraday came to the shop in February. She was 26 now. She had a 2-year-old on her hip, and she worked mornings at the elementary school cafeteria, and she had spent 14 months being the widow of a man the state had officially recorded as having killed himself through carelessness. She'd been told that at the funeral, in the kindest possible way, by 3 different people who thought they were comforting her. Kyle had found her. Ross had asked him to. She stood in the doorway of the back office and looked at the grid of packing lists on the wall and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "They gave me his bag back." Peter Faraday's kit bag had been in a closet in her mother's house for 14 months, unopened because she couldn't. It contained a harness, 2 lanyards, a helmet with a sticker of a cartoon shark on it, and a Ziploc bag of hardware. 9 shackles, purchased, according to the receipt still folded in the side pocket, from Hollister Safety Supply in Merrow Glen. 7 of the 9 were counterfeit. Ross Kastner drove her back to her car himself, on crutches, in a truck with hand controls he'd had installed in December, and when she cried, he did not tell her it was going to be all right. He told her that her husband had rigged it correctly, that the state was wrong, and that he was going to make them say so out loud, in public, with cameras. She asked him how long that would take. He said he didn't know. He said it would take exactly as long as it took to be unarguable. Roxanne Mullaney was 24 years old, and she had worked in the certificate office at Hollister Safety Supply since she was 19. Her job was to generate the paperwork, proof test certificates, conformity declarations, mill cert packets. She generated them out of a template. The template had a signature block for Greg Quimby of Anvil Certification Services, a one-man third-party inspection outfit in a strip mall in Merrow Glen that had, over 4 years, invoiced Hollister Safety Supply for $11,000 a month and had never once, to Roxanne's knowledge, sent anyone to a warehouse. She had asked about it in her second year. She was told the testing was done at the source plant and Quimby was just countersigning. She was 21 and she wanted to keep her job, and so she did what nearly everyone does, which is decide that somebody further up the org chart must have thought about it. Then in March she read a Cleveland Plain Dealer piece, Georgette Lamb had made sure it got written, about a steeplejack in Kinsler suing a distributor over counterfeit fall protection hardware, and it named a lot number, and Roxanne Mullaney sat at her desk and typed that lot number into her own system and looked at a proof test certificate she personally had generated 11 months earlier for a batch of product that had cleared customs 9 days after the certificate's test date. The test had been certified before the parts were in the country. She printed 412 certificates that night, at 11:40, using her own login, which she knew would be logged, and she put them in 2 bankers' boxes, and she drove them to a lawyer's office in Cleveland the next morning and sat in the lobby for 2 hours until somebody would see her. Special Agent Imelda Prieto, FBI Cleveland, worked counterfeit and substandard industrial components, which is an unglamorous corner of federal law enforcement that mostly involves aircraft fasteners and, occasionally, something that has already killed somebody. She opened a case in April. By June, what the government had was this. Hollister Safety Supply had, beginning in 2021, quietly moved roughly 40% of its rigging hardware sourcing to 2 unlicensed forges producing to no standard whatsoever, at about 1/5 of the cost. Drew Hollister had built the sourcing chain personally, through a shell called Ridgeway Industrial Trading. The parts arrived unmarked. They were stamped in a back room of the Merrow Glen warehouse with a die set that Prieto's team eventually recovered from a storage unit, including 4 dies for manufacturer marks belonging to companies that had no idea their identity was being forged. 3,140 shackles, 11 states, 6 years, 2 fatalities that Prieto could tie with confidence. Peter Faraday, 27, Ellicott, Ohio, and a 51-year-old sign erector in Bowling Green, Kentucky, whose family had never questioned a thing. Barnett Hollister, 79 and 3 years past his last real day at the office, would say under oath that he did not know, and the evidence would largely support him, and it would not save the company. And in the middle of all of it, in a subpoena return of cell site and messaging data, there were 2 phone numbers with 406 days of contact between them. One belonged to Drew Hollister, the other belonged to Rosalind Kastner. The pattern analyst's exhibit was 1 page. It showed, on 31 separate nights, 3 outbound signaling texts from the Hollister device to the Kastner device, spaced roughly 4 seconds apart, containing no text at all. An empty message, sent 3 times. A knock. Ross's attorney put that page in front of him at her office in Cleveland, and he read it for a long time, and then he took out his phone and pulled up a photograph he had taken in a hospital bed in October, of the inside of a butter cookie tin lid, and the column of dates a 9-year-old had written in pencil. August 3, August 19th, August 30th, September 11th, October 9th. Every one of them was on the government's page. Georgette Lamb looked at the two documents side by side for a while. "Your daughter," she said, built a call log. In August, 10 months after the fall, the Kinsler Board of County Commissioners voted to fully rehabilitate the municipal standpipe, blast it, recode it, replace the catwalk, and repaint the town's name 6 feet tall, and to hold a rededication on the last Saturday in September, with a band and a fire truck and the high school color guard, because a town of 11,000 takes what it can get. They needed a technical advisor to write the rigging and fall protection specification. Ross Kastner volunteered, for free. He was, by then, a local curiosity, the steeplejack who fell off the tower and sued a safety company, walking with a cane and a limp that would never leave, running his shop from the ground while Kyle Trainer climbed. The commissioners were delighted. It cost them nothing, and it made a nice line in the newsletter. Ross wrote the spec over 4 evenings at his kitchen table. It was 11 pages. 10.5 of them were unremarkable, standard language lifted from ANSI and OSHA, the kind of thing an engineer skims. Section 7.4 was 240 words long, and it was the entire year of his life. It required that all load-rated connecting hardware supplied for the project be subjected to a witnessed proof load test on site prior to installation at 200% of marked working load limit. It required that the test be conducted publicly at the rededication ceremony as a community safety demonstration. It required that the specimens not come from the delivery, that on the morning of the test, the county's independent inspector would drive to the supplier's warehouse, select 3 units at random from general stock, seal them in tamper-evident bags in the presence of a witness, and transport them himself. And it required a competitive low bid, open to any Ohio distributor in good standing. Georgette Lamb read it and said, "This is entrapment. It's a procurement document. Ross. They can bid or not bid," he said. "Nobody's forcing anybody to sell a county a shackle." Drew Hollister bid. He had to. That was the beautiful, ugly arithmetic of it. The plain dealer piece had cost Hollister Safety Supply 4 institutional accounts. His line of credit had been reduced twice. He had a federal grand jury he did not yet know about, and a lawyer he did, and what he needed more than money was a photograph of Hollister hardware passing a public proof test in the hometown of the man suing him, with the county's own inspector doing the sampling. Ross had counted on exactly one thing, that a man who had spent 6 years being told he was smarter than the trade would not be able to resist a stage. Drew called him, personally, in August, friendly as ever. "I hear you wrote the Kinsler spec." "I did." "Section 7.4 is a hell of a thing, Ross. It's a good clause." There was a pause on the line that lasted about 3 seconds, and in it, Ross Kastner heard a man decide he was being challenged rather than trapped. "You know what?" Drew said. "I think it's a great clause. We're going to bid it. And when your county pulls 3 units out of my warehouse at random and hangs a truck off them in front of a marching band, I'd like you standing there." "I'll be there," Ross said. Hollister Safety Supply won the contract by $940. The last Saturday in September was cold and bright, high thin clouds, the kind of day where the ladder rungs ring like a wine glass. They had set up in the gravel lot at the base of the standpipe, a hydraulic test frame on a lowboy trailer, borrowed from a crane rental company in Akron and calibrated 2 days earlier by a technician who had been paid by the county and who had never spoken to Ross Kastner in his life, because Georgette Lamb had been extremely specific about that. There were maybe 200 people. There was a band. There was a fire truck with the ladder up and a flag hanging off it. The Kinsler High Color Guard did their thing. 2 county commissioners talked for 9 minutes each about infrastructure. In the front row of folding chairs, the county's risk manager, the underwriter from the municipal insurance pool, the regional director of OSHA's Toledo area office, who had driven 2.5 hours because Georgette Lamb had personally invited him, Bruce Lindquist, Kyle Trainer, Elspeth Hargis, in her civilian clothes, who had taken the day, Franny Faraday, in the second row, holding a 3-year-old, and Rosalind Kastner, at the far end of the 6th row, because Tilly had a solo in the color guard's flag routine, and because a woman who is pretending nothing is wrong has to keep showing up in the places where nothing is wrong. Drew Hollister wore a quarter zip with his company logo on it and shook hands for 20 minutes. At 11:15, the county's independent inspector, a 61-year-old retired boilermaker named Lloyd Osgood, who had driven to Merrow Glen at 7 that morning, walked the racks with a warehouse clerk and pulled 3 shackles at random from 3 different bins, carried a sealed tamper-evident bag to the test frame, and broke the seal in front of the crowd and a cable access camera operated by a high school junior. He read the markings aloud into a microphone, because Section 7.4 required that too. Manufacturer, size, working load limit, 4 3/4 tons. Heat number, Ross Kastner, sitting in the front row with his cane across his knees, watched Drew Hollister's face at the moment the heat number was read out, and would later say that it was the only moment in the entire year when he allowed himself to enjoy anything. Because Drew had done the smart thing. Of course he had. He'd had his warehouse manager sweep the racks for 3 weeks and pull every questionable bin, and he'd restocked with genuine product bought at full price from a legitimate importer, and he was standing there absolutely confident. What Drew Hollister had not known was that in July, 6 weeks earlier, a 24-year-old former certificate clerk named Roxanne Mullaney had told Special Agent Imelda Prieto about the back room, and about the 2 pallets of pre-stamped inventory that Drew's warehouse manager had, on his own initiative, quietly folded back into general stock in June rather than eat the loss. The clean-out had been ordered from the top. The restocking had been done from the middle. Nobody had told the boss, because nobody tells the boss when they've saved him $9,000. The test frame took up the slack. The load cell display was on a monitor, 4 feet tall, facing the crowd, because Section 7.4 required that too. 2 tons, 4, 6, 8. The crowd went quiet, in the way crowds do when a number climbs. 9.5 tons, which is twice the working load limit, which is where a passing test ends. Lloyd Osgood, who had been told to continue to failure, kept going. 10.4 tons, the shackle bow deformed, opened, and let go with a crack that came off the side of the standpipe and rolled across the gravel lot like a gunshot. 38%. Nobody clapped. 200 people sat in folding chairs in complete silence, and a high school junior kept the camera on the monitor, and the OSHA regional director stood up out of his chair very slowly. Ross Kastner did not stand, or speak, or look at Drew Hollister. He looked at Franny Faraday, in the second row, and he nodded at her, once. The second and third specimens failed at 11.1 and 9.6. Special Agent Imelda Prieto and 6 agents executed a search warrant on the Merrow Glen warehouse at 11:52 that morning, while the band was packing up. They recovered the die set from a storage unit in Ellicott the same afternoon. Drew Hollister was arrested in the gravel lot at the base of the standpipe, in his company quarter zip, in front of the fire truck with the flag on it. The man in the gray jacket was named Ian Bellinger, and he had done route delivery work for Hollister Safety Supply for 4 years, and he lasted 11 hours in an interview room before he traded everything he had for a cap on his exposure. He gave them the hospital. He gave them the driveway on October 9th. He gave them Rosalind Kastner standing in a garage in a house on Delacroix Street, handing him a shackle out of a labeled pegboard and asking him, twice, whether it would look like an accident. Greg Quimby of Anvil Certification Services pled in November. He had signed 412 proof test certificates for tests he never witnessed, at $900 each, and he told the court he'd told himself it was a formality. Drew Hollister pled to conspiracy, mail and wire fraud, trafficking in counterfeit goods, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder for hire, and was sentenced to 31 years. Rosalind Kastner pled to conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction. At her sentencing, she read a statement about a marriage that had gotten quiet and about feeling invisible, and the judge listened to all of it and gave her 19 years and said, for the record, that a woman who removes a safety device from her husband's climbing kit is not describing loneliness, she is describing a decision. Hollister Safety Supply filed Chapter 7 in January. Barnett Hollister, 79, was not charged. He testified for the government for 2 days, and on the second day he was asked whether he had ever personally sold a counterfeit part, and he said no. And then he said, unprompted, that he had built a company on the idea that a man's gear should be the one thing he never had to think about, and then he could not continue, and the court took a recess. Ohio's Bureau of Workers' Compensation vacated the operator error finding against Peter Faraday in March and issued an amended report and mailed a copy to a 27-year-old widow in Ellicott who framed it. The Faraday Fund pays for third-party destructive testing of rigging hardware for any Ohio contractor who asks, free, no questions. It's funded out of the civil settlement. Ross put Franny on the board. She runs the intake now. Ross Kastner walks with a cane and will for the rest of his life. He does not climb for work anymore. He consults, he writes rigging specifications, and he teaches a 2-day course on hardware provenance to state inspectors in 4 states. And he opens it the same way every time, by handing out 2 identical-looking shackles and asking the room to tell him which one is a lie. He got full custody in February. There was no fight about it. In the front office of Kastner Height and Spire, mounted in a small oak case on the wall where the safety awards used to hang, there are 2 pieces of steel. One is a shackle in 2 halves, deformed and open. The other is whole and slightly scratched, and has a faint pencil mark on it from the inside of a butter cookie tin. Under them there's a brass plate with 3 words on it. Load doesn't lie. The Saturday after his 43rd birthday, Ross rigged the Kinsler standpipe one more time. A short climb, with Kyle on the ground and a doctor's grudging permission, and about 4 times the redundancy the job required, and went up to the catwalk to look at the town. Tilly, 11 now, stayed at the bottom holding the tagline, which is the rope you hold when you are the person on the ground. He was up there about 20 minutes. When he came down, she was sitting on the tailgate with the tin in her lap, and she'd taken the lid off, and she was looking at the column of dates written in pencil on the inside. You can throw that away if you want, he said. She thought about it, the way she thought about everything, for longer than most adults would. Then she put the lid back on. No, she said. It's a record. That's it. That's the story. I want to be honest with you about why this one got under my skin. It isn't the betrayal. I've told you 100 betrayals. It's the paperwork. Because Ross Kastner spent 19 years being suspicious of steel, and 0 years being suspicious of the certificate that came with it. He would have staked his life on a piece of metal he could hold. He did stake his life on a piece of paper he couldn't. And the people who hurt him understood that gap perfectly, because that gap is where almost all real-world fraud lives. Not in the thing, in the document about the thing. Here's the part I keep chewing on. A 9-year-old beat a federal fraud scheme, and she did it by accident, because she did 2 ordinary things that adults stop doing. She wrote down what she noticed, and she kept the piece of junk nobody thought was worth keeping. That's it. No genius, no bravery. A pencil and a cookie tin. Every one of us has a version of that list. The 11 minutes, the phone that's always face down, the recycling run that takes too long. Most of us talk ourselves out of it, because the alternative is unbearable, and because being the suspicious one feels like a character flaw. It isn't. Noticing is not the same as accusing. You're allowed to write it down and wait. And the last thing. Ross didn't win with a gun or a lawsuit or a viral video. He won by building a situation where the truth had no choice but to demonstrate itself. In public, on its own, in front of a marching band. He put a number on a screen and let the steel talk. If somebody's lying to you about something that matters, you usually can't out-argue them. But you can very often build a test they have to walk into. I'm Nathan. Thanks for staying to the end. Tell me in the comments, what's the small thing you noticed and talked yourself out of? Because I promise you, somebody else in that comment section needs to hear that they weren't crazy either.